Hi, I'm Izzy Conn, and welcome to this series, Leading Labour. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each of the former Labour leaders. The episodes all look at the same themes. They look at how each leader responded to major political developments, how they managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and, overall, how the leaders tried to win elections and bring Labour into government. We've reached the final week of the 3 Blair episodes. In the previous 2, we looked at the new Labour rebranding, media management, tensions with Gordon Brown, and then the controversial aspects of his legacy, namely the Iraq War. Today, we're looking at his public service reforms and the policy achievements of the governments, and how the changes were put into place. Then, we'll hear from the amazing guests from across the 3 episodes to assess Blair's legacy properly. Let's start by looking at what Blair's aims were when entering government with such a huge majority in 1997. The size of the majority meant that Blair didn't lose a vote in Parliament until 2005. Here's Sally Morgan, one of Blair's key advisors, and David Blunkett, who was first Education Secretary and then Home Secretary until 2004.
I think he set out with a broad view. He wanted to sort of modernise the country. So that included the public realm, it included the public services, it included almost our standing in the world. But, I guess to an extent the Constitution, and almost the relationship between how the British people saw themselves and where they were going to be. But that is all quite broad and nebulous. So I think in truth, it was a big modernisation project. The really granular detail, I don't think was really there in 97. But we were clear that that whole public realm, housing estates, infrastructure, arts, was part of the sort of country we wanted to create. Where the policy was actually up to at that point, I don't know.
I think Tony's biggest strength was the majority, that it was absolutely clear that he commanded not only the votes in Parliament, but commanded support in the country and initially with the broader media, and that he had the momentum of a programme to put into practice.
After Kinnock had led Labour to their 4th consecutive election defeat in 1992, Blair and those that became New Labour modernisers believed that strong media control and avoiding a tax and spend image would be key to winning next time. As part of this, before the 97 election, Gordon Brown, the Shadow Chancellor, pledged to stick to the incumbent Tory government spending plans for 2 years if elected. This risked the wrath of the left of the party and the unions, but it did help rebuild economic trust and meant the Tories couldn't make tax bombshell claims in 1997 as they had done in the 1992 election. However, it constrained their ambition and limited what could be achieved when they did come into government in the first term. The government didn't raise tax at all in the first term. They first raised taxes in 2002, when Brown announced a 1% increase in national insurance. I also spoke to Michael Barber for this episode. He was a chief advisor to David Blunkett at the Department for Education before establishing and heading up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which we'll hear more about later. Here he reflects on the issue of tax.
Labour governments do need to be cautious about tax because there's a suspicion that they will raise taxes and that the citizen won't benefit that much. There's also a risk, and we've seen this in past Labour governments, that they raise taxes and the money gets spent on the public sector workforces of various types, and they absorb more money, but the actual outcomes aren't improved. And the reason it's worth spending time on that is that was a big issue for Tony Blair, that I and others were responsible for trying to change. That yes, we would raise taxes, although not by that much, but in return we would deliver visibly improved outcomes that citizens would notice and see and feel and benefit from.
I started by asking the people I spoke to about what they saw as the key achievements of these years. It's important to remember that during the Blair years, the economy was really strong, with low inflation and low unemployment. By 2007, New Labour had presided over the longest period of economic growth in the post-war period. Thinking about the key achievements of the Blair years, John Rentoul, chief political commentator at The Independent, discussed the early move by Brown to give the Bank of England independence in setting interest rates, something that was previously done by the Chancellor. This move placed control in the hands of the bank instead. Here, John Rentoul discusses the importance of this early move.
Well, it was just a huge coup de théâtre. It was just a brilliant strike because it took everybody by surprise. The media absolutely loved it because it was so bold and exciting, and everybody agreed it was a good thing. Quite a significant minority of economists who didn't like it, but the vast majority of economists said it was absolutely the right thing to do. And to do it so quickly and so decisively, really just it had that huge effect in just it reinforcing Labour's reputation for economic competence. I mean, it was just a brilliant move.
He and John Davis, director of the Strand Group at King's College London, discussed another early achievement of Blair's, which was peace in Northern Ireland. After 30 years of the Troubles, Blair brokered a landmark agreement with Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern, the Good Friday Agreement.
The one that people always overlook, actually, is one of the earliest things that Tony Blair did, which was the breakthrough in Northern Ireland. I mean, that was a huge historical significance. And, people... I've always been able to stop Blair haters in their tracks just by saying, yeah, but what about Northern Ireland? And they say, oh, well, yes, he did that.
Even Jeremy Corbyn gave him credit for that during his leadership, I seem to recall.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. We can leave those at home, but I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this. I really do. And I just think we need to acknowledge that and respond to it. Now, maybe it's impossible to find a way through. Maybe even with the best faith in the world, you can't do it. But it's right to try. So I'm here to try.
The government expressly aimed to reduce poverty, and this included two flagship policies: introducing the minimum wage and creating Sure Start centres. Here's Alan Johnson, a key figure in the Blair governments, who served in many ministerial roles, including as Work and Pensions Secretary and Education Secretary.
I think mainly it was the attack on poverty. I mean, the extraordinary ambition to eradicate child poverty by 2020. And as the great epidemiologist Sir Michael Marmot points out, we were on course to do it. It had halved by 2010. And then in other areas, pensioner poverty, pension credit was a crucial aspect of that, lifting all these pensioners, mainly women, who didn't qualify for the state pension, they hadn't paid enough national insurance contributions. So lifting the state pension would have done nothing for them. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies said way back in 2004, when I was at DWP, that pensioners were no more likely to be in poverty than any other group in society. That was a huge achievement. Didn't get much of a fanfare. And then things like the national minimum wage, which was aimed at in-work poverty. So wherever you look, child poverty, pensioner poverty, in-work poverty, I think overall that was a huge contribution that we made during our 13 years.
Let's also hear from Clare Short. She was Secretary of State for International Development from 1997 to 2003, and Sally Morgan.
Minimum wage was a real struggle to get it adopted by the Labour Party because a lot of the trade unions didn't like it, free collective bargaining. Rodney Bickerstaff was one of the heroes of this. And I was a supporter. I was in that union and a friend of his. And we worked very hard to get that commitment. So, yes, there's an example that it was in the 97 programme, but it came out of a real internal Labour Party debate.
I think there was a really big focus on child poverty. And again, the gap has re-emerged because you have to keep going on these things. But they were very, very big. The change in child poverty and living standards for poorer families was colossal.
I also spoke to Polly Toynbee about these truly important changes. Polly is a leading political journalist at The Guardian and co-author of 2 books analysing the policy changes that New Labour brought in.
Of course, the Great Sure Start beginning, and it took to the end of Labour's time in power to reach 3,500 Sure Start centres, with the idea there should be one for every family within pram pushing distance, and that every child, every baby born would be cared for and the family looked after, and any problems they had, whether it was postnatal depression or other problems in the family, including unemployment, including depression, including addictions, could be dealt with early, so that by the time a child got to primary school, they were ready to learn. And that's what most people remember as being the great innovation in the Labour years. So I think that was probably the greatest achievement. Alas, it didn't last. It wasn't bolted down. And the Tories found it quite easy to get rid of it.
Blair set out that education was another top priority for office, mainly focused on schools and nurseries. Education was mentioned 45 times in the 97 manifesto.
And I tell you, education, education, and education.
From 2000, academy schools, publicly funded independent schools, were established. In his memoir, Blair writes that he felt this policy aligned neatly with our thinking elsewhere, to give schools independence, to set them free from the local authority system of hands-on control, and to let them innovate. Here's Sally Morgan.
There were about 200 utterly terrible secondary schools, and everything had been tried. They'd had turnaround heads, they'd had endless stuff, lots of money. It did not shift it. The development of academies came because we had tried everything else. In a sense, we looked at charter schools in the States and imported them. And the reason for that was new leadership, new freedoms, give the head to great head teachers or potential heads who really wanted to run with it, who were really ambitious. But also, in the early days, we had sponsors who put some extra money in. Later on, actually, they didn't put money in, but they came in really to bring a new set of skills to governance and brought in a load of new people to be concerned with running schools, in the same way you have our hospital trusts, really good outsiders.
They really focused on failing schools.
We focused very hard on failing schools, very much spearheaded by Tony, Andrew Donis, various people. And Andrew literally would get on the train and go around the country and see these schools and sort of work out what they needed. And alongside that, there was a sort of general drive of upgrading the teaching profession. How do you make sure you take great people and keep them and bring them through?
The previous government had commissioned an inquiry into higher education funding, which reported to the Blair government and basically said that tuition fees really needed to be introduced in order to keep the university system going. This was something that the Conservatives had been told many times over their years in government by civil servants, but had never dared to introduce. In 1998, Blair's government introduced fees for the first time of £1,000, which in 2004 was raised to £3,000, and as we know, today has risen to £9,535. In 1999, Blair announced that he wanted to see a boom in university education, setting a symbolic target that 50% of all under 30s would participate in higher education within a generation. Between 1997 and 2022, there was a 68% growth in applications and acceptances to university. The 50% target was reached in 2019.
There was a belief that university education should be expanded. The initial tuition fees of £3,000 was obviously controversial. It was extra money for the system. It wasn't to replace, it was extra money.
The government's also really focused on improving the NHS. Here's David Blunkett.
The reforms within the NHS, which didn't shine through for about 5 or 6 years, but then were quite dramatic. It's hard for people to remember that there was almost a drop of a quarter in deaths from heart disease in those first 5-6 years. Waiting lists were reduced from 18 months to 18 weeks on average. A complete transformation in the experience that people had, which led to a 70% plus rating in terms of satisfaction with the NHS, compared with today in 2024 of a satisfaction rating of just 24%.
John Davis believes that this saved the NHS.
If Blair hadn't, and Brown and all the rest of them, hadn't have done what they did, so that by 2010, 2011, the best thing that we've got, which is opinion polling, we've got nothing else really, the NHS was getting the best opinion polling since it was created. And I've come to believe that if New Labour hadn't have proved what you could do with the NHS, right now we wouldn't be looking at trying to save it, we'd be looking at how to dismantle it.
Let's take a look at how some of these changes were actually put into place.
If it's a Labour government, you want to try and deliver for the disadvantaged, if you like, you've got to have a coalition of support to do that. So bluntly, London schools, we wanted to deliver for poorer kids. But to do that, you've absolutely got to have the support of middle classes in London. So it was how do you keep everybody together other than the group who are always going to vote Conservative, and actually in the end, that's what they'll do. So public service reform, because that, not for its own sake, because that delivered better outcomes and better productivity, and but particularly better outcomes. I would say that as time went on, that became much more core to his thinking.
Michael Barber set up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in 2001 to monitor and accelerate the implementation of Blair's public service reform priorities. Let's hear from Michael.
The original idea was mine, according to Tony in his memoirs, but working with David Miliband, Jonathan Powell and others, we put together a blueprint where we pick some priorities across domestic policy and have it in a delivery unit. The idea was that from the Blair number 10, you'd have strategy looking 5 or 10 years out. You'd have the policy unit managing the stuff that was the white paper and the laws and the speeches that were being made across the cabinet. And then you'd have the delivery unit, was making sure that the goals that had been agreed with the Treasury would actually get done. Where there were goals that required interdepartmental collaboration, we provided a means of bringing that together. Whereas if you were just an individual civil servant on the drug strategy somewhere in Home Office and you're trying to get somebody in the Department of Health to do something, that's quite hard. But if the delivery unit's doing it with you, it's easier. The delivery unit was a real asset in that respect, because you could, once our status was accepted, and once the ministers and the senior civil servants saw us as an important part of the Blair operation, we could bring people together.
Blair gave priorities to the delivery unit in health, crime, education, trains, and immigration and asylum.
Health waiting times was really fundamental. They'd been published, the targets have been published in the 2000 National Health Service 10-year plan. And getting those done was fundamental. And you see how we delivered all those targets. Nobody waiting more than 4 hours for A&E. Nobody ultimately waiting more than 18 weeks for a routine operation. You see how difficult that is when you see how much the government in the last 10 years has struggled with it. Before the pandemic, it got worse after the pandemic, but they struggled and failed actually to meet the targets from about 2012 or 13. So that was difficult, and that was really important. And symbolically, they were fundamental, meeting those targets.
In terms of crime, which became quite a focus for the Blair governments that we haven't really looked at, the delivery unit focused on reducing street crime.
The crucial thing in the first half of 2002 was getting a grip on street crime, basically people being mugged and their mobile phones stolen, and getting the police chiefs from 5 big cities to get a grip on that was fundamental. That was our first big success, where the outcomes were going up and then suddenly they were going down.
Blair also wanted them to work on trains arriving on time.
Transport, the big thing was getting the punctuality of the trains to work, and that was a long slog, and they didn't really start improving until towards the end of 2003. But by then we had helped them solve some problems that they had given up on, basically, like leaves on the line and how to get the trains to run on time in October, basically. We solved all these problems eventually. So all of them worked, and by end of 2004, 80 or plus % of the targets that we'd set, we were on track to deliver.
Blair saw this process of delivery as really crucial and always believed that demonstrable outcomes would keep voters happy and able to understand the difference his governments were making.
Blair was personally committed to to the outcomes, and it wouldn't have worked without him. And he was committed to the outcomes. But remember, this is his second term, so he's learnt that he needs to prioritise. He knows he can't do everything to the same degree of intensity. So he was already a very good prime minister, and he was really committed to the agenda. And I think he was absolutely crucial to it. Fairly early on, he came to see the staff of the delivery unit, which he didn't need to do, and they found that pretty inspiring. Jeremy Hayward said to me, "You've got to write notes to Blair on a routine basis, keep him up to date," and he generally read those and got them back to me on a Monday morning. So he was a very, very good delivery prime minister. And I've worked with prime ministers and presidents all over the world on this, and very few of them are as systematic and good as Tony was.
Despite all this great work on the NHS, the reforms didn't really last beyond the Blair years.
The delivery of the reformed National Health Service was a big success. And I remember saying to the incoming Conservative government in 2010, it's a good idea to keep reforming the education system on health. You just need to get a grip on the costs because of the financial crisis, but don't change the pattern. And then they, I think, mistakenly passed the 2011 Lansley Health Service reforms, which did damage, actually. So I think that the health service was a big success for Blair.
There were two key problems, though, in cementing the changes of the Blair years. The first was that the government, with its tight hold and focus on media management, began to be accused of spin, which basically means propaganda, with Alistair Campbell seen as a mastermind spin doctor. It meant that people stopped believing stories of New Labour success and began to think that every positive story about the government was spin. Here's John Davis, John Rentoul and Polly Toynbee.
If you get a reputation for spin, you failed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bottom line, is that in the end, New Labour was a victim of its own success. It got a reputation for spinning quite early on, which was actually an obstruction and made governing extremely difficult. It's self-reinforcing. I mean, once you have a reputation for spin, anything you do to try to counter it is going to be seen as more spin. Everything that Alistair Campbell tried. I mean, he tried to withdraw himself personally from the role of being the Prime Minister's spokesman and get a civil servant to do it. And the journalists just said, "Oh, well, that's just spin, isn't it?" And he put the lobby briefing, the daily lobby briefing, he put that on the record, which is what the lobby had been demanding for some time. And as soon as he did that, they said, "Oh, well, that's just spin, isn't it? You know, the real stuff is going on elsewhere, so somewhere in secret." There was nothing he could do.
It's very difficult to get people to reflect backwards, partly because people only use those services for a certain chunk of their life. So if you've got children in school now, you wouldn't have children in school 10 years ago, probably. And the same thing with hospitals. You need them when you need them. Or indeed social care. Maybe 2 or 3 years in a family's life, they need social care for someone elderly. And the rest of the time, they don't think about it. And they certainly can't make comparisons with times when they weren't actually using it themselves.
The second issue was that they didn't manage to change the terms of debate around policy in the country, partly because they always had one eye on the right-wing tabloids, and because of their concerns with keeping their coalition of voters together. As I covered last week, the government was often shy of properly explaining and celebrating why changes were being made. This meant that voters weren't aware of the importance of the changes, and the Conservatives, once they came into power in 2010, could row back on much of what the New Labour governments had done. Here's Polly Toynbee again.
And indeed, they did a lot of very left-wing things. They just never used the language. They never used the E word, equality. It wasn't there. I mean, except in very specific terms. It wasn't there as a general sense of how they were going to govern or how to make the country more equal. I think they thought anything that sounded like socialism with an end point that ended up looking like communism still frightened people. I think there was still a sense that they have Labour has always had a hidden agenda to become more equal until we're all flattened out. That's what the Tories would use all the time as a weapon against Labour. So they didn't like to talk that talk. They walked the walk more than they ever talked it. which is a mistake in politics, really. You have to tell people where you're going and take them with you. Otherwise, you don't cement ideas for the future. And I think they never did quite define themselves because they were still so afraid of socialism.
Sally Morgan agrees that more should have been done to explain why what they were doing was so important.
But we also were at fault ourselves. So because we were so concerned about keeping the coalition, if you like, I don't think we ever really told the story of how progressive we've been, really. So, this massive number of kids lifted out of poverty, we never really banged on about it because you always wanted to feel that everybody thought that the government was working for them. And in retrospect, that was a really big mistake, because what we should have said is we've done this. And by the way, everybody should feel good about this because we're in a stronger position. In the same way, you can say to people, actually, antisocial behaviour matters, because otherwise that in the end impinges on everybody. You've got to find a way of telling a story that explains why you've got to invest in certain areas or certain people, or because that's good for the country. And I don't think we did that sufficiently.
I also spoke to Eunice Goes about this. She's a professor of politics at Richmond American University, London.
I think the main effects has to do at the level of debates and ideas, because it was a missed opportunity to change the terms of the debate. It was a missed opportunity to say, well, if we really want to empower people, if we really want to have a dynamic and highly productive economy, we need to tax more those who have the broader shoulders. We need to tax wealth and so on. So the opportunity to change the terms of the debate, it was missed.
Let's look a little more closely at what some of the people I talked to saw as issues going on behind the scenes that impacted how policies were delivered. Alan Johnson thinks the unions didn't work with the government enough.
The unions could have done much more. The unions were moaning. I mean, we were pouring money into the health service. Salaries were increasing like never before. For teachers and for NHS workers, you wouldn't have known it. Let's just go into any kind of conference, Unison or whatever. It was all slagging off Patricia Hewitt or slagging off whoever was being slagged off at the time. There was no recognition. There was always a long list of things we hadn't done, and there was never a recognition of the great things we had done, particularly for trade unions.
Eunice Goes explains the economic issues.
The growth model of New Labour was one that, in one hand, it reduced inequality, but with the other hand, it contributed to inequality, because it was a growth model that was predicated on the growth of the financial services industry that created many, 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 many millionaires, created a much riskier economic environment, and so it created much more inequality, much greater economic instability too, and it did not create that productive economy. So the economy that produces things, the economy that creates good jobs for a lot of people, as opposed to just creating good jobs to very few people, and then you're going to use the tax proceeds to, increase minimum wages here, increase child benefit there, offer a few more tax credits there. So these are, in the end, mitigating solutions as opposed to truly emancipatory and transformative solutions.
David Blunkett explains how this impacted particular communities, something which has become very clear since the end of the New Labour years.
And perhaps a failure to understand that there were whole communities that were being left behind. The success of the economy had been very much based on the growth and productivity of London and the South East, and to some extent of the great metropolitan cities across the UK as a whole. But there were very many left behind communities which were subsequently exploited in the run-up to the referendum on European membership in 2016 and exploited very effectively by Boris Johnson in 2019. So it was a slow-burning fuse of a country that had been doing extremely well until the global financial meltdown in 2008, but had not necessarily brought everyone up at the same level. So some people had done much better than others, and that reflected itself in in a critical mass in some of our what became known as left behind towns.
I wanted to leave a lot of time at the end of these 3 episodes to properly assess Blair's legacy, with some of the guests from across the different episodes. So let's hear from independent journalist Andrew Grice, David Blunkett, Polly Toynbee, John Davis, John Rentoul, Michael Barber, Clare Short, Guardian diplomatic editor Patrick Wintour, and historian Anthony Seldon.
As Blair puts it, quotes, you start as your most popular and least capable, and you end at your most capable and least popular.
And I'm one of those people who look back and reflect that he was a great Prime Minister and a great leader for the UK in a moment of substantial change. I think Tony Blair's legacy is the belief that Labour can actually win not just one term, but 2 or 3 terms in office, which means that they can carry out a programme. That continuity of policy and that consistency was unique, and nobody should underestimate the enormous achievement.
That he kept enough public confidence through all those years for a Labour government, election after election. That was quite a triumph. So quite apart from the good things that they did, and they were many, I mean, a million children out of poverty, 1 million pensioners out of poverty, Sure Start, schools, hospitals, change beyond recognition. The country was a much better place. And every Labour government has always left the country in a much better state than it inherited. And so I think that's what one should remember most about Blair, that he followed in that tradition. And people might be critical about a lot of things. And of course, Iraq was a disaster from which he is still personally not recovered. But everything else Labour did was very much in the Labour tradition of improving the state of the country.
I always say we should never live in the past, but we should learn from it. And one thing we might learn is that the election that you fight is the one today, not the one of yesterday. And the election you fight is one for a programme of government for years to come, not for one term in office followed by defeat. So what happens in the run-up to the election is critical to winning, but what happens after the election is critical to winning again.
But in terms of, legacy, what is a prime ministerial legacy? Are you changing your country forever? Are you making it better forever? Maybe. But in terms of those years, when Blair went abroad, people listened, right? Wherever he went, he was, maybe the last of the great British prime ministers to actually go round the globe. Some people say that's a good thing. But it was undeniable, right? US presidents saw him as a friend, right? Whether it was Clinton or whether it was Bush, and even those subsequently, they seek his counsel. But the country was happier. I'm sorry, it was happier.
It was happier.
He was very bold, so he was determined to make a difference and to be seen to make a difference and to get things done. He was also very willing and open to learning as he went as Prime Minister. So he came in, as he says in his memoirs, without any experience of being a minister, never mind being Prime Minister in 1997. And he learned as he went. And you see in A Journey, his memoirs, you see he describes his learning experience. So by the time we set up the delivery unit, he and I, in 2001, he had learned that you need more than good speeches and great communication and random initiatives. You need a systematic approach to driving change in the outcomes, not just publishing white papers and passing laws. So he learned as he went, and I think that is enormously to his credit. But I think Blair emphasised the outcomes more than most of his, probably all of his predecessors, and more than nearly every leader I can think of around the world as well. So it was radical.
I mean, he was a very successful prime minister, and he was a prime minister for a long time. But I mean, in the end, an awful lot of what he set out to do ended up turning against him. I mean, he wanted to put Britain at the heart of Europe. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, you could argue that that it was a new Labour decision to allow free movement of workers from the new countries in 2004 that led to Brexit. I mean, there's a bit of a long connecting series of links, but I mean, you could make that argument. And of course, the backlash to the Iraq War in the Labour Party meant that he didn't succeed in changing the Labour Party. Although now, you could say that the Labour Party is back on the Blairite track. But on Europe in particular, I think he didn't succeed.
I think the Blair, and it's not just him. That current, I mean, there's been battles between right and left in the Labour Party too much in the past, infighting almost for its own sake. But this is a historic shift to absorb lots of the Thatcher agenda, to not believe really in social democracy.
One of the issues is, I think, it's taken the Labour Party a very long time to sort of get over Blair one way or another. And people still, a decade afterwards or more, tend to, not explicitly so much anymore, but implicitly, there's a lot of definition of oneself as to whether, how you stand on the kind of Blairite issue. I think it sort of muddled up a lot of the internal Labour Party debates about policy, so that I think some of the reforms that he introduced in the public services became more controversial than they need have been, because they were associated with the man who'd taken the country to the war on a lie. So it sort of, of course, it's damaged his reputation hugely.
I think it was flirtation with the right, that his idea of triangulation was that he could somehow end politics, that we could all be united under one slightly blurry Blairiness, and the politics could be forgotten. But in the end, there is always a right and a left. In every country in the world, there is a progressive and conservative force, and you're either on one side or the other. And he tried to forget that. And in the end, that undermined Labour's position.
Well, Blair was one of those. He enjoyed the game. He enjoyed campaigning, and he was phenomenal at it. The biggest, the most time for a Labour Prime Minister for a Labour Prime Minister ever. 3 huge election wins, 2 of the biggest, the two biggest since the Second World War. I repeat that again and again and again because people forget it, and actually it is so important.
This part of being a great leader is to believe in something very, very strongly and to have the capability to drive it through. So I think a figure of enormous importance for as long as Labour Party history is studied, and always a figure around whom debates will swirl.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on Tony Blair's reforms and legacy. Today, we've heard from Sally Morgan, David Blunkett, Michael Barber, John Rentoul, John Davis, Alan Johnson, Clare Short, Polly Toynbee, Eunice Goers, Alan Johnson, Andrew Grice, Patrick Wintour and Anthony Seldon. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy any of their amazing books, are in the description of this episode. Next week, we'll be on Blair's successor and Chancellor throughout the whole of the Blair years, Gordon Brown. Please subscribe so you don't miss out. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. The artwork for this episode was also done by me. Music is by Rickard Fromm.